This is Unit 3, Video 2, and in this video we're going to look at the Constitution. We'll look at Federalists first. The Federalists argued that the rights of states and individuals would not be left vulnerable by the new Constitution. They said that the new government it designed was designed to protect citizens from the abuse of power at the federal level, and that was a concern of many throughout the nation. They also believed that this limited government that they created would not give one branch of the government too much power. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and Madison is actually called the father of the Constitution because of how much he contributes to it. These were two of the leading Federalists of this time. The other group is called the Anti-Federalists, which is pretty easy to remember. This is the group that opposed a strong central government and therefore the Constitution, and they're known as the Anti-Federalists. They feared this type of government would eliminate the power of the states. It was something that was evident when the founders created the Articles of Confederation, that they were afraid of this strong central government, and the Anti-Federalists echo those fears. Their fear of this government, again, goes all the way back to King George III. And a couple of leading anti-federalists are Patrick Henry as well as George Mason. Here you have a chart that just kind of breaks down real simply the different parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And you can see some leaders, what they were really about, a Bill of Rights you'll see with the Anti-Federalists, and we'll take a look at the Bill of Rights at the end of this video. So the first question asks you, how did the views of the Anti-Federalists and Federalists differ concerning the role of the federal government? The Anti-Federalists were afraid of the strong central government, and the Federalists wanted a strong central government. They said it was created to protect the rights of people. So their views really are on opposite ends of the spectrum, because one wants a strong federal government, which is the Federalists, and the other, the Anti-Federalists, wants a weaker national government. They are afraid to give a federal government that much power. Next up, we'll see the Federalist Papers, and these were a group of letters, several articles that were written to really draw favoritism towards the Constitution. Because debate raged over ratification, which is agreement of the new Constitution, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote a series of articles over several months, and they were called the Federalist Papers. The articles supported ratifying the Constitution, and they explained the intent behind many of the Constitution's major provisions. They also argued that the Constitution protected and strengthened the United States, and that citizens really had nothing to fear because of the checks and balances system. So your two questions here. The first one asks, how did the Federalist Papers convince people to support a new Constitution? The whole goal was they were trying to calm people's fears that this Constitution was going to be, all powerful or anything like that. They wanted people to understand that the Constitution had checks and balances, and that it set up a limited form of government, and the states and federal government would share power. The other question asks you, what role did Hamilton and James Madison play during the ratification discussions? They were very outspoken. They were also major contributors to the Federalist Papers, and so they really took a front seat in much of these debates. So what is a limited government? And we'll see that in these next couple of slides. To reassure people that the Constitution would not become too powerful, the writers created it with different divided powers as this limited government, and power is going to be divided in two main ways. The first is that power was divided between the state and the national government, also called the federal government. The other way power was divided was in the federal government. Power within the federal government was divided between three branches. Each branch within the government had the power to check the other two branches, and that's how we get the system called checks and balances. And this system is a major feature of the Constitution today. Here you see a very simple chart which does not include anywhere near all of the checks and balances that each branch has. In the top left you have the president, on the top right you have Congress, and in the bottom you have the Supreme Court, and it shows how each can check the other as well as be checked by the other two branches. So it shows that system there of a checks and balances. We had a couple of major compromises at the Constitutional Convention, and we'll take a look at those now. A major issue facing delegates was how to give representation in Congress. The states that had larger populations, they wanted a system that was based on population, while the smaller states wanted representation to be equal. They said if you're a state, you should get as many votes as any other state. However, the larger states that have more people said, well, it should be based on how many people you have. So we get the Great Compromise. This made a bicameral legislature. So bicameral means two houses. So a two-house legislature with a House of Representatives that was based on population, which is what the larger states wanted, and a Senate, which was based on equality for all the states, which is what the smaller states wanted. So both sides kind of get what they were hoping for. You can see here the two different plans. The New Jersey plan was one that wanted equal representation, so this is one the smaller states favored. And the Virginia plan wanted representation based on population, and this was supported by the larger states, obviously. And so you see the Great Compromise at the bottom, how they dealt with that, and that's the system that we have today in Congress, two houses. Another big issue, as it has been, really since the 1600s and is going to be for another 100 years, was slavery. When the Great Compromise was passed, Southern states demanded to be allowed to count their slaves toward their population. They said if the House of Representatives is going to be made up based on our populations, then we want to count the slaves that we have. Northern states, however, resisted this, and so we have the Three-Fifths Compromise. The compromise allowed states with slaves to count their slaves as 3/5 of their population toward representation in Congress. So if a state had 500,000 slaves, then they could count that as 300,000 toward their population, which is somehow more degrading than counting 1 or 0. It also allowed for the slave trade to continue for 20 years and demanded northern states return runaway slaves to their owners. Despite the degrading origin of the Three-Fifths Compromise, it played a vital role in the ratification of the Constitution. The last thing we're going to look at is the Bill of Rights. Because one of the principal reasons that the colonists rebelled was the belief that Parliament had infringed on their civil liberties, the Anti-Federalists demanded a protection of those individual liberties, and we have that as the Bill of Rights today. This is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and it convinced Anti-Federalists to ratify the Constitution. Most people know the Second Amendment, the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the right to petition, the Second Amendment, right to bear arms. So those types of rights that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights are given to American citizens with the Constitution, and that was really the linchpin that convinced many anti-federalists to ratify the Constitution that we still use today. So your final questions here. The first one asks, what did the Great Compromise determine? It determined how many houses of Congress we would have, and we have a bicameral legislature, so it determined how many houses we have. It also determined how those houses would be represented. One was on population, the other was based just on equality. The next question asks what the Three-Fifths Compromise do. So that determined a state's slave population that they could count towards representation in Congress. So the southern states wanted to count their slaves so they could have more representation, and the northern states obviously had an issue with that. The third one here says, why did people support the idea of a limited government? They liked the idea that the government couldn't get too large, that they couldn't overreach, and so that was a big selling point for the Federalists in getting others to support the Constitution, because people like the idea of the federal government being restrained and not having anywhere near the power that Great Britain had had. The final question asks, how does the Bill of Rights protect individuals and states from the federal government? And so the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments in the Constitution. And so it gives us individual liberties. It gives the states rights that the federal government can't take away. And so it protects those constitutionally in the federal government for citizens and states.